Today's subject is the digital archive, and I think that particularly in India, whenever we talk about digitization or even digital cultures, we first think about the digital archive, because archive building has for the last few years been a significant aspect of digital work done throughout the country, and this has gathered some kind of momentum, and it is entered into the way that we think about endangered resources. One of the most usual suggestions for the preservation of endangered material, be it audio-visual or textual, has been to digitize that material and to store it in an accessible form. A number of questions, I think, need to be clarified before we come to describing the digital archive as it is. First of all, let's have a look at the archive in general. As we all know, an archive need not be digital. There are many archives. In fact, the greatest archives in our country and indeed around the world are non-digital archives, what we call physical archives. There's some kind of distinction that we make between an archive and a library. A library is for books. An archive is for documents, files, state papers, other kinds of both textual and non-textual material which we can access in the archive, whereas our idea of the library is more or less confined to the printed book. This need not be the case. It is not that these categories are fixed, but this is something that I think many of us generally think about the archive in this way. The need for digitization of archives appeared as a major concern, particularly in our country, I think, some 20 years ago, or perhaps a little more than that, where increasingly we found that there was an immense amount of physical material which was severely endangered, and every passing day increased the danger to it. And so, with the easier availability of digital technology, we found that one of the ways of trying to create accessible copies of such material and to make it available to users, and also to preserve the material in some form. It is here that the question of digitization came up. Some 2 decades ago, I remember that in the National Library of India, there was a project of digitizing early books, which meant in our case, books printed before 1900. Now, digitization as a means of preservation, as we all know, is something of a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, digitization is relatively inexpensive, it's relatively easy, it does not require very sophisticated equipment, to say computers and digital cameras or scanners are sophisticated, but they have, as it were, entered into our life patterns, as it were, particularly in academic circles or in those of archivists and librarians. And therefore, without really acquiring very sophisticated equipment, we can produce reasonably good copies, which can be used for consultation, which can be easily stored. And of course, one of the great virtues of the digital medium is that digital space is virtually inexhaustible. It can be increased, as it were, fairly simply, and as file sizes get larger, as digital artifacts consume more space, the repositories also grow from gigabytes to terabytes, from terabytes to the next stage. I'm sure it will go on like this. But when we think of the digital archive, which is, of course, in many institutions, in many places all over the world, we find that it is now possible to access material which is not available earlier, that is not available for consultation. You might say that here the internet plays a critical role, that the internet makes this access easily accessible, this access easily available to all kinds of users all over the world, or at least that is the ideal situation. And to tell the truth, many such archives do exist. For instance, there is the large text archive, which is entitled archive.org, which is the address archive.org, and out of copyright books, particularly in English, Roman script, there's a very large collection of that, and this can be accessed, most of it can be easily accessed from any part of the world. Now, actually, when we got to this point, we really confused a couple of things. One is the idea of a digital archive, and the other is the question of access. The digital archive as a means of preservation, as I said, is a double-edged weapon. Because, as on the one hand, the digital medium offers us an almost inexhaustible and relatively easy means of copying material, there is no guarantee as to the durability or longevity of these copies. And there is, I think, among people who work in the digital sphere and who have, in fact, got over the initial enthusiasm of thinking about the digital as a kind of cure for all human problems, that digital media, digital data is actually not the most desirable format or the most desirable state for preservation. Nevertheless, because of, let me give two reasons for this. One is that digital media, we have no real idea of how long it will last. There are some people who say that if the life of a book is approximately 50 years, the life of a digital artifact is not more than 5 years. Or, in fact, if you look at digital service providers, you will find that most of them do not offer services for periods more than 5 years. And there's this term which is used in digital circles, which is it's an abbreviation, which is EOL, which expanded means end of life. So you cannot expect that if you make a digital copy and store it somewhere, it will last forever. In its particular condition that it exists in it now, it has a limited span of life. What we will hope is that it will be taken over to the next stage of digital preservation. That the archive has to be self-replicating and self-preserving. That is to say, within the archive, there must be a means of carrying the material, the digital material, from its current condition to more sophisticated or more advanced states. And if that is not there, then archives are likely to become unusable over a long period of time. So that is one of the reasons why one can't really think of longevity, that's the long-term view. We are digitizing material because we would like them to be accessible 50 years later. That digitization may be a step towards that goal, but it is not the achievement of that goal, not in the state. The second problem, of course, is one which we encounter in every sphere in which digital technology touches our lives, and that is that of obsolescence. Technological obsolescence, of course, is something built into the history of technology. Newer machines come or have come over time, and older machines have become obsolete. So, things which were created for older forms of technology, media which could be played on earlier forms of technology, become unusable. This is not so much a problem of the printed word, because we can read a manuscript, we can read a book, we can read an e-book, a physical book and an e-book. It makes no difference. But if you consider a gramophone record, a 78 RPM gramophone record can be played only on equipment which allows you to play it, and many, because today the gramophone itself is nearly defunct, but gramophones made in the last 20 or 30 years, in many cases, did not have this facility. And if you look beyond the gramophone, for instance, there was the phonograph, the cylinder phonograph, which of course is, even if you were to find a lot of cylinders today, they would be very difficult to play. So, the obsolescence of media, the obsolescence of technology becomes a problem. And we were talking about technology in the largest sense, but in the digital realm, technology is, the rate of obsolescence is very high. Forms that were in use 15 years ago are no longer in use. I can give the example, for instance, of the floppy disk. Even the CD, which is almost certainly on the way out. New computers, as you will have seen, do not come with a standard issue CD drive. And you will also have noted that today for storage, there is an increasing shift from movable media, that's to say hard disks, older forms of hard disks, to what we call static media. And it is quite sure, I think, that such forms of static media which are now available in relatively smaller units will become available in far larger units very soon. So even as we speak, perhaps, there's been an exponential increase in easily available. I'm not even thinking of the top end user. The user who is looking for the most sophisticated technology available in the market. But those which we can easily acquire and use for our day-to-day. And if you think of that, the computer that we use today, 15 years ago, that would have been unthinkable even for a high-end user. So, in the computer world, obsolescence, in the world of computers, obsolescence is something which is a way of life. And it is here that the fate of digital data that constitutes the digital archive becomes critical. Because is there any guarantee that the digital data which is carefully stored today, carefully created digital artifacts with proper metadata, which are stored in some kind of appropriate condition, that they will be available that they can be played or they can be accessed on the technology which will be available to us 20 years hence. So, what then is the answer to this, if there is an answer at all? The answer, of course, is that against the fragility of digital data, as common day-to-day users, we are constantly advised to make multiple copies and store them in different places. Archivists talk about disaster copies too, which are stored in a place which is, as far as possible, insulated against fire, storms, and so on, other kinds of natural calamities. Undoubtedly, for more sensitive data, there are more sophisticated places where such material is stored, but that need not concern us immediately. The second point is that in every digital archiving project, there must be some kind, if it is a long-term project, it must have inbuilt into it, a way of carrying the work forward, to say, of modernizing itself, of keeping up. So if a digital project has been going on for many years, then one of the tasks is that the material which was recorded earlier or created into digital artifacts earlier has to be transferred to newer platforms, to newer means, or newer. So, the digital archive is here to stay because, as I said before, it is relatively inexpensive. It is in keeping with the sentiment of our times. It's very important. It's more important than we think. That if you were today to propose to some funding agency that we want to make a physical archive, they would say, why don't you make a digital archive? Digital archives are even now fairly saleable. The idea of digital archives is a saleable idea. It offers, as it were, it offers some very great advantages. It offers advantages of reproducibility, that's to say, digital copies, of course, there is no distinction between the copy and the original. So, in the case of, even if you were to make a photographic copy of a book, and make a photographic copy of a photographic copy, you would end up losing fidelity very soon, or make a taped copy of a taped copy. But digital data can be reproduced, as far as we can see, without appreciable loss, innumerable or endless number of times. There is portability, there is accessibility, But then accessibility also often becomes a problem, because the digital archive, when we think of the archive not just of private users, the archive also has to abide by laws, regulations, the various kinds of protocols which govern our access to material. So if one thinks of the digital medium as offering this promise of universal accessibility, in actual fact, digital archives, even those which are available over the internet, tend to have inbuilt limitations. They may be sign-in archives, they may be funded or paid archives. It requires institutional subscription or private subscription to access the material. And if it is the more valuable and the more desirable that material is, the more it is likely to come within such restrictions. And of course there are other kinds of restrictions that, even though we have very large digital archives all over the country, much of it cannot be shared over the internet purely because of questions of intellectual property and copyright. So these are some of the problems which we must consider while thinking about the digital archive.